Greetings, future scholars of America. We have come to the end of our road in terms of verb videos. Part 9 is our last installment of the verb videos, active versus passive voice. Admittedly, I would have loved to have dragged this out to an even 10 parts. It would have been so much nicer and more complete, but in the words of the philosopher Mick Jagger, you can't always get what you want. So let's dive in, shall we? Now, a sentence in the active voice is when the subject performs the action of the verb, like this. Joe wrote the play. Joe is performing the action of writing upon the play. The difference between active and passive is that a sentence in the passive voice when the subject receives the action of the verb. So it's a difference between performs and receives. For example, the play is not performing any action in this sentence. The play was written by Joe. So the play is receiving the action of being written. Okay? Now there's this big, I don't want to say controversy, but there's this big discussion over when you should write in the passive voice and when you shouldn't. Most writers discourage ever writing in the passive voice unless you're writing a legal document, because the active voice is usually a stronger, more direct way of expressing ideas. Use the passive voice only if you want to emphasize the receiver, like if you wanted to emphasize the play instead of Joe, or you don't know who the performer is. For example, Romeo and Juliet was performed. Here you want to emphasize Romeo and Juliet. You could put it in the active voice and say actors performed Romeo and Juliet, but it kind of takes the emphasis off of the play. Or, for example, the theater was burned down. We don't really know who burned down the theater, though. Although I would argue, I think it sounds better if you say someone burned down the theater, but that's just my personal opinion. If you understand this comic and think it's funny, congratulations, you understand the difference between active and passive voice. And here's a helpful tip. You can add by a zombie after the verb if you have passive voice. So for example, Joe wrote by a zombie. Doesn't really make sense. But the play was written by a zombie. Does make sense. Or Romeo and Juliet was performed by a zombie. The theater was burned down by a zombie. Helpful tip for you to distinguish between active and passive. Now, because this is our last video, there's a bonus thing that I want to share with you. This is totally not necessary. You can stop this video at any time and don't have to check out these bonus features. But I personally love the author Stephen King. He's a famous horror writer who wrote Pet Sematary, Carrie, Salem's Lot, She's anything you can think of. Stephen King's written it. And he once wrote a memoir called On Writing the Memoir of the Craft. And he has this whole section about why he hates the passive voice. And I think he's a great writer and it's very entertaining. So I'm going to read it to you as if I'm Stephen King. Again, you don't have to take notes on this or even listen to it if you don't want to. But here we go. One of my pet peeves has to do with the most basic level of writing, and I want to get it off my chest before we move along. Verbs come in two types, active and passive. With an active verb, the subject of the sentence is doing something. With a passive verb, something is being done to the subject of the sentence. The subject is just letting it happen. You should avoid the passive voice. I'm not the only one who says so. You can find the same advice in the Elements of Style. Messieurs Strunk and White don't speculate as to why so many writers are attracted to passive verbs, but I'm willing to. I think timid writers like them for the same reason timid lovers like passive partners. The passive voice is safe. There's no troublesome action to contend with. The subject just has to close its eyes and think of England, to paraphrase Queen Victoria. I think unsure writers also feel the passive voice somehow lends their work authority, perhaps even a quality of majesty. If you find instruction manuals and lawyers' torts majestic, I guess it does. The timid fellow writes, "The meeting will be held at 7 o'clock, because that somehow says to him, put it this way, and people will believe you really know. Purge this quisling thought. Don't be a muggle. Throw back your shoulders, stick out your chin, and put that meeting in charge. Right? The meeting's at 7. There, by God, don't you feel better?" I won't say there's no place for the passive tense. Suppose, for instance, a fellow dies in the kitchen but ends up somewhere else. The body was carried from the kitchen and placed on the parlor sofa is a fair way to put this, although was carried and was placed still irk the boop out of me. I accept them, but I don't embrace them. What I would embrace is Freddie and Mira carry the body out of the kitchen and laid it on the parlor sofa. Why does the body have to be the subject of the sentence anyway? It's dead, for boop's sake. Forget about it. 2 pages of passive voice, just about any business document ever written, in other words, not to mention reams of bad fiction, make me want to scream. It's weak, it's circuitous, it's frequently torturous as well. How about this? My first kiss will be recalled by me as how my romance with Shayna was begun. Oh man, who farted, right? A simpler way to express this idea, sweeter and more forceful as well, might be this. My romance with Shayna began with our first kiss. I'll never forget it. I'm not in love with this because it uses with twice in 4 words, but at least we're out of that awful passive voice. He goes on and on, but I'm going to stop there. If you enjoyed this excerpt, and if you ever want to be a fiction writer of some variety, like novels, short stories, plays, or whatever, I would highly recommend picking up a copy of On Writing a Memoir of the Craft. It is not only informative, but incredibly entertaining and well written. I actually have a copy if anyone wants to borrow it. Just let me know. All right, that's all for today, future scholars of America. Until next time, happy learning.